Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, May 21st, 2021, and today we're going to be taking a look at Senator Ron Johnson from the state of Wisconsin, the sole Republican out of all of the Republicans that are up for re-election in the 2022 Senate elections that comes from a Biden state. Now, there are other Biden states where there are Republican incumbents. In fact, actually, not other Biden states, but rather another Biden state. The state of Pennsylvania, which has a Republican incumbent, Senator Pat Toomey, he is not running for re-election. But Ron Johnson is the only Republican up in a Joe Biden state in 2022. And he has yet to announce that he's running for United States Senate. But we're going to be talking about everything today that might indicate he may not necessarily be running for Senate, and his sort of complete, full-blown President Trump type of status and, ideology that he has adapted following the 2020 election. So this one state, the state of Wisconsin, Ron Johnson is the incumbent Republican, and he has yet to announce that he's running. But he is the likeliest close embodiment to a President Trump in the state of Wisconsin. And we'll talk about what that means for his re-election bid and why that probably won't help him in a state that just flipped towards the Democrats after voting for Donald Trump in the 2016 election. So a little bit of history. Ron Johnson was first elected back in 2010 as a political outsider, had no other type of political experience, very similar to President Trump, largely came out of nowhere, was a part of the Tea Party movement in 2010, and won the state of Wisconsin against the incumbent Senator Russ Feingold. Fast forward 6 years later, he won by 5 points in 2010, won by a narrower amount in 2016, facing off against the same exact Democratic opponent, Russ Feingold, the former incumbent. Now, Ron Johnson won this race by 3.4%. But, it was smaller than 5%, actually 4.9 down to 3.4, which questions whether or not he would actually win again in 2022. Given the reduction from 2010 to 2016, chances are that he would win, but a number of other circumstances have certainly made Wisconsin a little bit more difficult for a Republican like himself to end up winning. Fast forward to the 2020 election, Joe Biden flips the state of Wisconsin from the Donald Trump column in 2016. Donald Trump won the state of Wisconsin by around 0.8%. Joe Biden wins the state of Wisconsin by around 0.7%. So Joe Biden wins by a smaller margin than President Trump, but at the end of the day, it's a flip towards the Democrats. So Wisconsin is a state that hasn't always been competitive, but that Ron Johnson has had a pretty strong victory in 2010 with 5 points following Barack Obama winning the state by double digits. Fast forward to 2016, Hillary Clinton, yes, loses the state, but by less than a percentage point. Russ Feingold loses by around 3 points, 4 points. So Wisconsin, a state that seems to be voting for Ron Johnson more than it does on the presidential level for Republicans, and sometimes that carries him over to victory. Now in 2022, he's not entirely sure what he's going to do. The initial answer was no. When he was elected back in 2016, he made a promise that he would not run for Senate in 2022, that 2 terms was enough. He had promised that if elected to 12 years in the United States Senate, he will not turn towards another election. Well, now we don't know. Why don't we know? Well, Ron Johnson has spoken on it recently. Ron Johnson has said that he hasn't made a decision, but leaving office is probably his preference. And why is it probably his preference and not his preference? Well, he said he made the promise to the Wisconsin people that he wouldn't run for re-election under the assumption that Democrats would not have a trifecta. Unfortunately for him, Democrats have a trifecta now, which means that his incumbency and the state of Wisconsin being red matters now more than ever. In addition, the reason why he might also try to run is because President Trump has endorsed him. Yes, he was questioning whether or not he should run, but President Trump has already said, run, run, run. I was thinking about that for a second. I was like, am I going to say run 3 times? No, run, 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 because this is a senator who, if he was to run for re-election, would possibly help the GOP. Not a single Republican has announced that they are running because they are waiting to see if Ron Johnson is going to actually run for United States Senate. They are going to see whether or not this guy is going to be putting himself in the race, or whether or not we should be looking for an open seat, whether or not the Republicans should be fielding another candidate. And we don't entirely know. When you look at those in the potential column, you're talking about a representative, current one in the 8th district, a former one from the 7th district. You're talking about the former lieutenant governor. You're talking about a candidate for Senate in 2018, the former member of the Wisconsin Board of Veterans Affairs. You have a U.S. representative from the 1st district. You have people that are recognizable. You have the Kenosha County Sheriff. You just have possibilities. But the thing is, we are waiting on Ron Johnson's answer. But he already has the endorsement of President Trump, which might actually make it seem as if he shouldn't be running or will not face any primary opposition. When you're looking at President Trump's endorsement of Ron Johnson, it seems more like a pressure play than anything else, because he's still saying, my preference now is to leave. But the comments that he has made and his intentions of voting to object to the electoral certification in the state of Wisconsin won't help him. Following the 2020 election, there was all of these claims of election fraud, and Ron Johnson seems to be feeding into it. Ron Johnson called the Capitol insurrection a peaceful protest, stating that this was something that was done by patriots, essentially making it seem as if there was not an insurrection on the Capitol, but rather just a largely peaceful protest. And it's unfortunate to see that Ron Johnson, as a senator from a state that is a swing state, be so far, I would say, on the right, because that doesn't help his re-election bid. As someone who's looking at this from an analytical point of view, you are not looking at a state like Wyoming. You're not looking at a state as partisan as South Dakota or even neighboring Iowa. The reality is, Wisconsin is most recently a Democratic state. In 2018, the Democrats won the governorship against Scott Walker, someone who survived a recall. You also have Joe Biden winning in 2020. You had Tammy Baldwin winning in 2018. You had victories for Democrats in an election that occurred earlier in 2020. Fast forward to the end of the year, Joe Biden wins the state. So I never really understood why Ron Johnson has gone full on for President Trump, because it's not as if he offers him some type of electoral advantage by going this far. But it's not just the comments about the Capitol insurrection being largely a peaceful riot. There's also many other major missteps, including his original plan to vote to object to the electoral certification of certain states. He went in on January 6th, right up into that vote, with every intention of refusing to certify the electoral college results. He was going to join apparently 10 other Republicans in the Senate, because not even the majority of them were into this. The majority of the Republicans in the House were. The majority of the Republicans in the Senate were absolutely not. But to join 10 other Republicans puts him already in the minority within his own party, which puts him in an even more minority group amongst the American public. Ron Johnson has been loyal to President Trump. I think he cares more about appeasing President Trump than he does about his re-election chances. Because at the end of the day, he did make that promise that he wasn't going to run. And yet he still hasn't announced that he's going to. Honestly speaking, I think Ron Johnson is tired. I think he doesn't want to run anymore. Otherwise, he would have already announced. This is prime fundraising time. He could be tapping in to some of the dislike amongst President Biden's administration, amongst Republicans, to get some money for a re-election bid. This is the prime time, because he can tap into certain things that have to do with COVID that won't be relevant in a year from now. He can tap into certain things in the economy and gas prices that won't be relevant in a year from now. But instead of doing that, he's waiting to give us an answer, which sort of tells us everything that we need to know. This is prime fundraising time. He has already received the endorsement of President Trump, which means that the primary process will go seamlessly. The only thing holding him up, it seems to be, is his own conscience. Whether or not he will decide to stay in the United States Senate or not. And it seems as if, based off what he's told us so far, that all signs are pointing towards no. And this election will be one of the closer ones. I don't think the closest, but I do think it will be close. Wisconsin is a state that will matter a lot. If Wisconsin is able to go blue, chances are Pennsylvania will as well. But Wisconsin is a state, if Ron Johnson does decide to run, that Democrats are also going to look at it and say, this is our vulnerable Republican. If anyone, it's Ron Johnson. If any incumbent Republican was to be in a position where they could lose, they would first turn towards Ron Johnson. And another reason why he might not be deciding to run is because he's looking at the election results. 2010 was a landslide year for the GOP in the House, and largely in the Senate. 2016 was an anomaly on the presidential level that Ron Johnson might think is the reason why he was carried over in the United States Senate. And looking at 2020, it sort of reverted back those gains by the GOP on the presidential level. And it is quite embarrassing as an incumbent to tell, anyone or just be that incumbent that is voted out by your constituents. If voters look at Ron Johnson and say, I don't agree with his statements about the Capitol insurrection, I think that he lied when he said that he was going to leave, I don't think that it's right that he was going to vote against the electoral certification, then changed his mind following a storming of the Capitol. Some voters might look at that and say, I find that to be disingenuous, and might reject him. Instead of leaving on his own terms, he might end up losing. Same result, just one is more shameful and embarrassing than the other. If you're able to say, I fulfilled my campaign promise of 2016 and decided not to run, nobody will blame you. But if you do run and lose, then questions start circulating. How did I, as an incumbent, lose? Do my voters no longer love or adore me? Am I no longer approved amongst my constituents? Did voters that voted for me 2 times turn their backs against me a 3rd time? These are the types of things that candidates never want to ask themselves, that campaigns and parties never want to ask themselves, because it is embarrassing to lose as an incumbent. It means that your own voters that chose you sometimes multiple times have finally decided they're done with you. Instead of doing that, he might try to opt out. He might not run and say, I left on my own terms. I was not going to lose re-election, of course, but I just decided that maybe I won out. Maybe the Senate isn't for me. In a very similar fashion to Rob Portman, he could easily say, it's gotten too partisan. But because of his statements, I think that's this one article talking about how Ron Johnson will likely run, if he is to run, as a culture warrior. What does that mean? It means that he will go in as someone who is anti-cancel culture, as someone who is pro-President Trump, as someone who has been, in very much right-wing, someone who doesn't care about the Democratic Party's establishment and agenda to oust him as a senator. He might go in and say, I have been vilified by the left-wing media. I am here for you. There was no insurrection at the Capitol, etc., etc. Whatever he would want to say, he could say it and try to win over the Trump base with that. But the thing is, that's not the majority of the country, and it's certainly not the majority of the citizens in the state of Wisconsin. It flipped for a reason. I could never really wrap my head around Ron Johnson and his willingness to adapt President Trump's philosophy and President Trump's campaign tactics. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't benefit him that much. Donald Trump didn't win the state of Wisconsin in 2020. He didn't win it by a landslide in 2016. The last time I had voted for a Republican before President Trump was Ronald Reagan in 1984. So when I'm looking at Wisconsin and I'm seeing it as a state that is purple, that swings back and forth, and then you show me Ron Johnson, someone who refuses to admit that the Capitol insurrection actually occurred, someone who perpetuated lies about the 2020 election and continues to do so today, that's when you start to question, how did they even get elected in the first place? But the thing is, they were different times. 2010 and 2016 are not like 2022. We are still amidst a global pandemic. The response to it will largely determine the outcome of the 2022 midterm elections. The swiftness in the vaccine distribution and the quick end of a pandemic could boost the Democratic Party's chances. And Wisconsin, out of all states, will be target number 1 for the Democrats in terms of states with Republican incumbents, if Ron Johnson does decide to run. Everything that he has said so far sort of tells us that he personally doesn't want to run, but that he's being pressured to run by the Republican Party. And he might actually be doing his own re-election bid with some of these more preposterous comments. Day after day after day, you see headlines about Ron Johnson saying that he would have felt less comfortable had the people in the Capitol been people from Black Lives Matter, that the insurrection wasn't an insurrection, that he felt safe within the Capitol, that there is this team out here to take down President Trump going all the way up to the executive level. I mean, Ron Johnson is as pro-Trump as you can get. He's not a bipartisan senator. He's not someone who votes for the Democrats half the time and Republicans with the other half, considering he represents a Democratic state as of the 2020 election. Instead, he looks at it and says, I'm going to vote the way that I want to vote. And while that is some way, we do elect our senators to give them the choice of free will, he is going to receive negative backlash for his comments, for everything that he has voted on, whatever it might be. It will come back to hurt him in his re-election bid. And that's only if he decides to run. So the Democratic Party will be targeting Ron Johnson down to the fullest extent as the only Republican incumbent from a Biden state. All eyes on Wisconsin. I don't think it will be the closest race of the 2022 Senate election or the most heavily fundraised for, but I certainly think it's worth looking at and will hold a lot of turmoil and a very big determining factor as to whether or not 2022 ends up being a red wave year or a blue wave year or somewhere in between. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.